It is 10 a.m. on the 20th of August. My name is Boaz Shoshan, and welcome to another episode of Southbank Live. I'm joined as ever by John Butler, and today we're going to be discussing the petrodollar system and what the US's withdrawal from Afghanistan means for it. John, thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure as always, Boaz.
Yeah, it's been quite a week. Very dramatic scenes we've seen from Afghanistan. And of course, this marks a huge shift in America's foreign policy. After being there for almost 2 decades now, and I believe more than $2 trillion spent and 6,200 American lives, both military and contractors, lost over there, it does mark a real shift for things. And of course, we in the UK were also involved in the Afghan war. We have seen, I think it was more than 450 British military personnel died out there. So it's a very grave situation. It's always been a grim situation out there, but we are seeing a really big shift for it. And of course, the purpose of today's episode is to discuss this and the financial implications of this, the investment implications for it. And I think the best way we could start with this, John, is to go into some of the history of the petrodollar system in general. A lot of people probably won't be familiar with it. It's a very neat conjugation of words, petro and dollar, and it has been around for some time now, a very long time indeed. Though it has existed actually before it was dollars. There was a similar system when it came to pound sterling, when the British Empire was around and oil was in its ascendancy. But it is that is what that's what we'll be discussing today. And there's so many aspects of this we could go into, so many different pathways, stories from the petrodollar system's history that we could explore. But we should kind of keep it kind of compressed, keep with the main themes of it. For anyone watching, this is a live stream, of course, but there shall be a recording made available later. If you are enjoying these, I do encourage you to subscribe and do feel free to leave any comments in the chat box, or if you're watching a recording, to comment below this video. John, petrodollars, where should we start? Because last week we did go into Nixon and the gold shock, and of course the petrodollar system as we know it today came into force only quite soon after that. And this was, I think, due to necessity for how we're going to back the dollar. If we're not backing it with gold anymore, why would anyone want a dollar? Well, a dollar needs to be good as gold for oil, was the trade made. I think it was Kissinger was very involved with that. But John, could you give us some of the backdrop to this? Because if Afghanistan marks sort of the collapse of the petrodollar system, let's start with how it all began in the 1970s.
Yes, well, in the 1970s, of course, the world is adjusting to the end of the Bretton Woods arrangements, whereby the dollar was backed by gold. And that system, the Bretton Woods system, was very successful in terms of providing international monetary stability to help with the reconstruction of Europe and Japan. And it was generally a very healthy period for economic growth. The problem with that was that the U.S. was disproportionately funding that, right? It's not just the Marshall Plan. There was all kinds of other stuff that was going on, including, of course, the U.S. fighting the Cold War, trying to protect the reconstruction of Europe and Japan from what was seen at the time as a very aggressive Soviet Union. And so, the United States by the late 60s was really spending a lot more money than it could credibly do and still support the gold backing for the dollar. And so Bretton Woods breaks down. The Vietnam War, which was very expensive, was a big part of that. In any event, so Bretton Woods breaks down and the world fumbles around for a new sort of international monetary foundation, which they try to renegotiate in 1973, but they fail.
Right.
The oil producers respond to all this because it's an implied devaluation of the dollar in real terms. Oil producers respond to this. They form OPEC and they start to increase prices and run the oil industry as a cartel, as it were.
Yep.
And this then forms the basis for what I believe there's enough diplomatic evidence that a deal was eventually done. You mentioned Kissinger. Volcker was also involved. But a deal was essentially done by the end of the 70s, early 1980s, that the United States would, well, first of all, the United States would set interest rates at a much higher level and stabilize growth in the US money supply, and by implication, stabilize the dollar itself, on the one hand. On the other hand, the big oil producers would agree that henceforth they would reinvest a material portion of the proceeds of their oil revenues in US Treasury securities that would help to keep US interest rates relatively low and stable.
Yep.
Security of the major oil fields. And that, of course, has formed the basis of US, Middle East, and much foreign policy for all the years since, and indeed is part of the underlying reason, perhaps, behind the war in Afghanistan.
Right. I think a lot of people get accused of being into conspiracy theories and things like that when you start discussing oil and Iraq and Afghanistan and indeed Syria. In fact, all of America's involvement in the Middle East. If one starts discussing oil, a lot of people will think you are some kind of fringe conspiracy theorist. But I mean, it's really hard to separate energy security for America.
It is. It is. I mean, look, the single largest consumer of petroleum in the world is the U.S. military. Okay. I mean, the fact is that and you don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to see the underlying logic that there is a natural deal to be done between a hopefully benign hegemon, that is the United States in this case,
Yeah.
and far weaker countries around the world whose borders may not be entirely secure, who nevertheless have valuable natural resources in the ground, oil being arguably the single most important one. And so there's a natural deal to be done there. It makes sense. There doesn't have to be anything evil, nefarious, conspiratorial about it. It's just the way the world works. But as with all such arrangements, shifting alliances, shifting economic developments, be whatever they are, these regimes, they come and they go and they get modified and they get adjusted. The British Empire is a classic case in point.
Yep. Yeah, I think there's a lot of parallels there, and some interesting as we are talking about petrodollars and the decline of sort of imperial financial pillars that hold the whole thing up. I mean, one of the things that, of course, the British Empire lost was the sort of dominance in the Middle East over oil production. Saudi Arabia being the sort of the key pillar of that. Saudi Arabia became very strongly allied with America rather than with Britain. So I think for Britain, it was Oman that was the key ally. And there's this interesting period during the 1950s where, Britain is still trying to hold on to its imperial foundations, while America is this, ascendant superpower that is trying to force Britain out of it. There's a very, very curious historical phenomenon that takes place in the 1950s with a place called Barami Oasis, which is between Oman and Saudi Arabia, where there was oil fields, or there was the idea that there might be oil there, and Britain sent, because it was in this contested area between Oman and Saudi Arabia, there was this sort of sudden rush out there to try and get whatever oil there might be and to claim it. And there's Anthony Eden, who of course is much more famous for being the prime minister during the Suez crisis. He at this point is he's the head of the Foreign Office, or what was probably called the Colonial Office at the time. And he actually sends a cable to the US State Department saying, "We're going to Barami Oasis, and if we find any Americans there, we'll kill them." And to imagine this happening now is absurd. The idea that the UK Foreign Office, Dominic Raab would say something like that to the Americans is absurd. But this struggle for oil in the Middle East was so highly strung at the time, because of course it is such an important element for civilization as we know it in the West today.
Absolutely. I mean, again, you don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to see the logic here. And indeed, it's even difficult to understand World War I if you don't understand oil politics, because it is not a coincidence that Germany, together with the Ottoman Empire, was trying to expand its influence into the Middle East, and in particular to the oil fields. It was very deliberate German policy to try to get to those oil fields somehow. And of course, the British were aware of that. And that was one of multiple, don't get me wrong. I mean, there are many causes of World War I, but oil politics was a contributing factor.
Yes. And when we're moving to the 70s, another element of this is the shift in the power over these oil fields from Anglo-American companies through to these, nationalized, state-run Middle Eastern firms. So Aramco, of course, being the Arab American oil company, of course, becomes much more political for the Saudi Arabians. But prior to this, this time in the 70s, when we're thinking about the 1950s and 1960s, for that matter, it was still this another sort of remnant of the British Empire. You've got the Seven Sisters, right? These massive oil titans that were, that are still around today. So we've got BP, Chevron, etc. But this shifted after the Second World War. This started moving much more of the power went to the oil producers. As you say, they created the cartel known as OPEC, and they started making demands of things. So I think the America's support of Israel during, I think it was the Yom Kippur War in the 1970s, was key to the Arab oil embargo. So this is the Arabs saying, we are not going to be exporting oil, which you need so much, because of your support for Israel. And this is what then further on leads to the petrodollar arrangement, where you have the Americans going to the Arabs saying, we'll give you all the arms you want, we'll give you our protection in the Cold War, and we will actually give you the contract with our major engineering firms in order to modernize your economies. All you have to do is price things in dollars, reinvest the excess into our government debt. And then, I think part of the arrangement, actually, it was in a book called Confessions of an Economic Hitman by John Perkins. He said that another part of the arrangement with Saudi Arabia was that the interest on those government securities, right, on that government debt, was what was being used to then fund the revitalization. Well, not even the revitalization, the modernization for a lot of these areas in the Middle East, where prior, there wasn't a garbage disposal system. They just let the goats come in and take a lot of the rubbish away. So there's all of these sort of interesting layers of Anglo-Arabian government intrigue, economic espionage, lots of interesting things that we can pull at. But ultimately, John, this petrodollar system has been the foundation for a lot of the modern financial system as we know it, a lot of capital flows following the 1970s, right?
Absolutely. And so what is happening today with the U.S. deciding that its position in Afghanistan is really no longer tenable, is an extremely important signpost in this regard, because for years we have been observing the rise of China as an economic power. To some extent, we've seen also a very, very dramatic and I would say impressive recovery in Russia, following what was a complete meltdown of their economy a couple decades back, right? Yeah. And these two countries have established what appear to be quite solid diplomatic relations in recent years. And guess where Afghanistan sits, right? It's basically between their two respective spheres of influence. And with the US withdrawing, it's clear that there is a shifting balance of power in Central Asia, and a region that has tremendous untapped natural resources, untapped in part because of what you just mentioned. That is, the infrastructure's never really been built to get those natural resources out. But hey, it could be that maybe China and Russia are going to start moving in that direction. The fact is, the world is becoming more multipolar. It is still operating under a de facto Pax Americana regime when it comes to freedom of navigation, right? But when it comes to the conduct of affairs in Central Asia, the US is kind of leaving the stage, and that's a very significant development.
Right. So if we take a look at Afghanistan itself, obviously Afghanistan is not a major oil producer, but of course it is hugely key to the region itself and understanding, so all of the Middle Eastern alliances, because Afghanistan is just right in the middle, right? It's effectively in the center of the world island, as Mackinder would call it. So what is the importance of Afghanistan within this petrodollar system?
Well, again, I think that it's largely of symbolic importance. And don't get me wrong, as you just said, yes, its geopolitical position right at the crossroads of Central Asia, where there are key mountain passes and so on and so forth. Absolutely. I mean, that's why the British and Russians fought over it for decades back in the 19th century, and that's arguably why the U.S. has been there until very recently. And so this is, I mean, it is geopolitically very important, but I think its economic significance, that is from a global financial markets perspective, is much more on the symbolic side in that it does demonstrate this growing multipolarity in the world. And that multipolarity, other factors equal, is going to diminish the use of the dollar as the world's primary reserve, transaction, accounting, and invoicing currency. Other factors equal, that will push up US real interest rates because there'll be less natural underlying demand to hold dollar balances vis-a-vis the other options out there, the other currencies that are competing in this increasingly multipolar world. And it's an interesting one, again, as a historical parallel. Something similar happened in the 1870s and 1880s. And the so-called classical gold standard emerged out of an emerging multipolar world order as the British Empire gradually began to lose its own global economic and political power vis-a-vis a rising industrialized Germany, a rising industrialized Japan, and Russia itself was also beginning its own industrial revolution by the late 19th century. I, of course, haven't mentioned the United States. That's obvious that the US was in the ascendancy at the time. But you had a multipolar world order, and it became increasingly difficult for the British to basically finance their empire given that rising competition from all over the world.
Yeah, there are so many interesting historical parallels we can draw there, John. Just to wind back slightly, with so America is withdrawing from Afghanistan. This is a great, a massive signal, right, which we should be paying attention to. As you say, more symbolic when it comes to the petrodollar system, but when you consider the amount of money, over $2 trillion, even today, 2 trillion is still a big number, relatively speaking. When we're thinking of why America is doing this, is it simply too costly to support? What do you think the Americans in the likes of the State Department and the Pentagon, etc., who've used these oil revenues for so long, what do you think they make of this? Would you not want to try and continue the system?
It's much easier to manage your ascendancy as a power than to manage your decline. Managing decline is very, very difficult, and this is why Churchill and others they had a very difficult hand to play. They did everything they could to try and hold the empire together. That said, they did realize that beyond a certain point, it was more about managing decline.
Yeah.
And so that and to be fair, I mean, if you look at history, the British arguably managed their decline fairly well. I would argue the special relationship with the United States was absolutely essential in that regard.
Yeah.
But okay, so here we are today. What's being discussed in the halls of the U.S. State Department now? I actually do happen to know a few people who inhabit those corridors, although believe me, they're not going to give me any privileged information. But what I would sense has been long discussed in the U.S. Before Trump even came to power. Was how are we going to get out of Afghanistan? I think that there was kind of this already this acceptance that looking longer term, there just was not a tenable role for the US as an occupying power in Afghanistan. It just wasn't going to work. China was becoming too powerful. Russia had recovered too much. And just at some point, the US was going to have to get out. And I believe during Trump's presidency, which of course is the presidency that did put together a comprehensive withdrawal plan by the second half of his term, that plan was in motion, and that plan I don't believe would have ever been approved had it not had fairly broad support in the U.S. So I think there was already this building consensus that the jig was up a little bit, and the U.S. is going to have to manage its exit from Afghanistan. And Biden, of course, has overseen the actual execution of that, and many people think he's done an absolutely horrific job. Certainly, there's quite a bit of evidence to that effect. But this idea that the U.S. just decided yesterday to get out is not true at all. I think a broad consensus probably was already in place 5 or more years ago.
Yeah. Yeah, again, there's so many ways we could go on with this. When it comes to managing a decline, some people still think America this is simply something of a growing pain before America, goes through another phase of ascendancy and then, maybe this time actually admits that it is an empire rather than a constitutional republic. But when we're looking at that petrodollar system, John, when we're thinking of, oil needs to be priced in dollars, and as a result, there's a huge underlying demand for the dollar, which helps prop up American assets, including American real estate, American stocks, because they have that dollar premium on them. And whether or not that is how that is fading, there's that how the global reserve currency keeps its reserve currency status. With Afghanistan, it is the most obvious of American withdrawals from the Middle East. But there have been plenty of other American withdrawals from the Middle East over the past, just during the Trump presidency and indeed during Biden presidency. When you're thinking of certain military installations in that region, so I think there's a broader shift away from there. Do you think that we're going to see oil producers start looking to the likes of China or Russia to backstop them and give them a bit of military support, or do you think that these alliances that America has made will stand tall and still be very important in the region?
Well, look, I think that the underlying nature of all geopolitics, in my opinion, is the concept of a balance of power. I mean, look, everyone wants to be more powerful, everyone wants to have secure borders, and everyone wants to have foreign influence. And if that's necessary through military means, then yes, countries can get aggressive and fight wars. But the fact is that the only thing that kind of all countries can agree upon is that war is kind of very expensive and politically frequently very unpopular. So let's at least try around the margins to avoid that as best we can. And so let's try to maintain some sort of balance of power where we can understand our adversaries' intentions reasonably well. And indeed, you could argue that this concept of a balance of power is what drove European politics following the 30 Years' War and following the Congress of Vienna. I know you mentioned Kissinger earlier. He's written books about it.
Yeah.
And I think the same thing is going to happen in the Middle East and Asia. I believe that all of the players, however small, will seek to play off the interests of Russia versus China versus the United States, and of course, versus each other to try and maintain their respective spheres of influence, however small. And now one would like to think that that will be a generally peaceful process. And I have some optimism in that regard. But there are still lots of borders in that part of the world that were never drawn in the right place. There are lots of borders where that are ethnic borders, perhaps, but without a natural geographical border, such as a large river or major mountain range or whatever it is. And sadly, those areas may, some of those disputes may have to be sorted out through military means. But when the smoke clears, I believe what you're going to simply see is a multipolar order emerging in Eurasia, with the US being just one player at the table. And so this will, again, other factors equal, undermine the dollar's preeminent status and will lead to a relative increase in US real interest rates vis-a-vis the rest of the world. That will relatively impact American economic competitiveness, that is the cost of capital, as it were, for the US economy. And that will be a blow. The US is not going to be able to keep running this growing warfare welfare state the way it has been unless it becomes a more competitive economy in future. The US is a huge net importer. That can't go on absent this petrodollar system.
Yes, as you were saying earlier, John, most countries don't want war. They're very expensive, they're very costly, and they would rather avoid them. But when you have the world reserve currency status, you can sort of abuse that status to some degree, and you can actually manage to afford $2 trillion wars that don't really get you anywhere, and still somehow sort of emerge being, oh well, we've done that. It's now it's time to focus on something like Taiwan, for example. When we're thinking of the dollar, ultimately it's a devaluation of the dollar would be well, I think is what we're discussing, and how that may influence financial markets. Obviously, pretty good for gold in general. Some people have thought that petrodollar system evaporating means that gold becomes a key input for oil exporters. So instead of holding all of their wealth in US government debt and in dollar-denominated securities or dollar-denominated real estate, things like that, then they're going to start saving their oil surpluses, their profits, in gold. Is that
this is the, I mean, this is one of the core theses of my book, The Golden Revolution Revisited, is that if you assume, as I do, and I have for years, that the world is moving towards a more multipolar, economic and political order, well, then that obviously, if the dollar is going to lose its preeminent status, the question you have to ask is what's going to replace it? But is the euro in a position to do that? Is the Japanese yen in a position to do that? Is the Chinese yuan in a position to do that? No, no, no. And in fact, the only currency that everyone can agree does not benefit anyone at anyone else's expense is a neutral international currency. That is gold. That has always been gold. And there's a reason why, you had Pax Britannia running on a gold standard as successfully as it did for so many years. I believe what we're heading towards now is going to be eventually a new international monetary system where gold plays an explicit role.
That's interesting, John. When you're talking about Pax Britannia and the gold standard underpinning a much broader and an imperial structure, so Britain was still at the top of the heap there. When you're looking at how you get a Pax Americana, because we still have Pax Americana, right? The U.S. Navy is still making the global commons peaceful. They're still making sure pirates aren't out there, managing to get a hold of these oil tankers and massive container vessels. The fact that the US Navy is doing that is one of the reasons why these vessels have become so big and are so slow. They're only run from a sort of an economic perspective rather than a security one, because these tankers don't need to defend themselves because the US Marine Corps has got their back. So the US Navy is still in that position of securing the world's oceans. However, we are talking about the dollar losing its sort of preeminence. So do you think we might get still a Pax Americana, where it's still America at the top of the heap, but there is a much more, similar to Pax Britannia, there is a gold element here that is backing the whole thing up?
There is a natural tension between sea power and land power, and the oldest of the old geopolitical theorists, you can go all the way back to Thucydides if you want to include him in that group, but certainly Halford Mackinder and Alfred Thayer Mahan and Nicholas Spikeman, who became, who all rose to prominence in the 19th and early 20th century. Basically, there's this natural tension, and the United States is a natural sea power when viewed from a global perspective. Now, don't get me wrong, it's a big country with a lot of land mass, but when you look at a global geopolitical map, the US is a natural sea power, right? It has a Pacific coastline, it has an Atlantic coastline, and so it benefits from that tremendously. And so it has the natural influence and the natural desire for freedom of the seas and freedom of navigation for these reasons. Whereas Russia is not a natural naval power. They don't have a warm water port other than the Black Sea, which is a bottleneck, right, because of the Bosporus and Dardanelles. Okay, and China, well, that's an interesting one because they are a natural land power and they are an emerging sea power. But the Chinese Navy, when it comes to open water, open ocean operations, is not yet anywhere near in the same league as the US Navy and probably won't be for decades. So you have this natural tension between land and sea power, but that just contributes to the overall picture of emerging multipolarity in major global political, economic, and monetary affairs.
Yeah. On that note, John, you mentioned the managing a decline, right? You've got to know how to lose if you're playing the game as a great power. And a big masterstroke for the British Empire in retaining some element of influence abroad was making sure after the whole Suez Canal incident that we were on good footing with the US. So of course things were pretty bad in terms of UK-US relations for a while there, and it was in a very much a financial sense that the British Empire sort of lost its legs because America just threatened to dump all of its sterling, all of its British government debt, and suddenly the market for sterling and gilt just dried up very, very quickly. And this was sort of a way of winning a war without firing a shot when you've got financial warfare. And when it comes to making sure that you're getting on well with the ascendant superpower, if we're thinking of America as being in decline and China in its ascendancy, well, it doesn't seem like American-Chinese relations are particularly good. So, when it comes to the sort of the injured bear as it's going down, is going to be swiping out at the young newcomer. How do you think this is going to? How do you think this is going to?
Well, look, there is a very dark outcome here, and if you use World War One as a parallel, you can kind of see it. Now, I alluded to this briefly earlier, but the geopolitical situation around the turn of the 20th century was that Britain was declining in relative terms vis-a-vis industrializing Germany, industrializing Russia, and the continued rise of the United States. And the dark parallel there is that Germany's rise to power, it got to the point where Germany was a credible threat to the sources of oil on which the British Navy, and hence by extension the British Empire, depended. That was seen as a mortal threat by the British. And again, I don't want to get into conspiracy theories here, but there are many historians who believe that Britain was far more prepared and ready for a potentially big bust up with Germany already by 1905 or so, when Germany was starting to assert itself in various parts of the world that were seen primarily as areas of British influence. And again, the real issue becomes this potential reach of German power all the way down to the Persian Gulf, through the Ottoman Empire, and through what becomes Iraq and Kuwait today. And that, I mean, that was seen as a mortal threat. And there was just no way, in my opinion, the British would ever have allowed that to go ahead without confronting Germany militarily in some way. That World War I came about precisely the way it did. Again, there's plenty of conspiracy theories about what happened in Sarajevo. We don't have to go there.
Right.
But the underlying geopolitical parallel between rising Germany and declining Britain, there are certain similarities between rising China and declining America today.
Yeah, you do wonder which of these historical parallels, which of these which of these sort of snapshots we may see a repeat of, because of course we've been talking about the 1970s, we've been talking about the British Empire and its decline. One wonders which is the optimal sort of comparison one could make. John, we have been carrying on for just over 32 minutes now. Just going to take a little look at the chat because we have got quite a few comments here. When it comes to petrodollars, we do have a question from Skeptimistic who says, what indicators show us the movement of petrodollars? Are they being held? Are they being sold down? Who is starting to move away from the USD and to price oil in other currencies? So a lot of questions there. Good morning, Skeptimistic. Thank you for that. When it comes to the movement of petrodollars, John, I mean, if we're talking about US government debt, I mean, you can see who owns how many US treasuries, thanks to the US Treasury Department publishing these. But it comes to the other movements of petrodollars. I mean, you can look to real estate. I think Knightsbridge would probably be a key area in London which a lot of petrodollars are being held. But when it comes to just the general movement, the general flow of them, where would one go looking for them?
Yeah, it's difficult to get detailed data on precisely how oil producers' surpluses are invested, but you can come up with estimates based on official data that is compiled by various governments and also by the IMF. And certain other international organizations. And basically, the simplest sort of back of the envelope way to do this is just take a look at the surpluses that are being run. That is the trade surpluses and current account surpluses that are being run by the major oil producers. And then take a look also at roughly what portion of reserve assets are dollars. And that portion has been in gentle decline in recent years, but it's still pretty high.
Yep.
And then basically just multiply one by the other, and just take a guess that that's roughly the portion of oil revenues that are in dollars. They correspond roughly to the dollar's share of global official reserves. But of course, that's not just treasuries. That's taking a look at the big picture. As you mentioned, that's looking at real estate purchases. That's looking at equity purchases. That's looking at purchases of other forms of debt security, such as corporate bonds. And the fact is that all the big sovereign wealth funds in the world, be they official or unofficial, they invest in all of the above for the most part. I mean, Norway is the single biggest one of all at whatever it is, 113 billion or something like that. But there are many, many others, and they're and some of them are huge. So in any event, that's a simple back of the envelope way to sort of get a sense of how big these petrodollar flows are and have been in the past. They have certainly been large enough to place natural downward pressure on US real interest rates and natural downward pressure on risk premia for US assets. And that's one reason why the US stock market looks a bit expensive, if not in some people's eyes, very expensive vis-a-vis the rest of the world, including comparable economies, that is, relatively free market, relatively developed Western economies.
Yes, there is a very good book for anyone listening who is interested in reading up on this topic further, called Anglo-Arabia, which takes a big look at how Britain retained its influence after the end of the British Empire by maintaining its contacts with in the Gulf. So if you're looking at bank deposits throughout the developed world, if you're looking at Paris, New York, Arabian bank deposits in London far exceed any other financial center anywhere. And obviously, places like Knightsbridge in London will speak to the wealth of.
Well, that has a lot to do with the Eurodollar system and the favorable, effectively offshore tax treatment that it provides, depending on how your domicile is structured, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, and the petrodollar and the Eurodollar system, one kind of leads to the other.
Yes, absolutely, that's right.
Yeah. Now, moving on to another Skeptomistics questions, just in terms of who is starting to move away from the USD and to price oil in other currencies. There was the big event a few years ago where we started seeing oil futures contracts denominated in renminbi, and the amount of volume that these futures contracts got was a lot higher than expected. It's now quite a big contract. But more broadly, John, I think Iran does like to sell oil in euro, or at least it really wants to. In terms of the amount of other currencies that are being used to trade oil, it's still pretty heavily denominated by the dollar, right?
Yes, it is. But as you point out, I mean, that has been changing in recent years.
Yeah.
And indeed, there's nothing to stop China and Iran, or China and other countries, some of which are not necessarily on friendly terms with the United States. There's nothing to stop them making their own bilateral arrangements. It's just that those bilateral arrangements will have to bypass the dollar, because if they don't bypass the dollar, then the U.S. will see precisely what's going on. And in theory, they can put a freeze on those payments, such as that, in this case, Iran, wouldn't receive the payment. I mean, the U.S. has that power. And they have to be careful how they use it, because, of course, if you simply start throwing sanctions on everybody, then everyone switches out of the dollar into using something else. So there's a sort of a balancing act that the U.S. has to play here, kind of a carrot and stick approach of dollar diplomacy vis-a-vis the rest of the world. However, the trend is clear. The dollar's role has been declining, will continue to decline, and that's only natural given the broader geopolitical context we've been discussing.
Indeed. James says gold, gold, gold. Well, good morning, James. We are very much friends of gold here. We do get a comment from Charles. It says, taking into account your comments on the petrodollar and the vast costs of decarbonization, are we set for a repeat of the early 1970s with an accompanying gold rally? Very good question, Charles. That is an interesting one. When it comes to decarbonization and how this makes doing anything much more expensive in the near term, it is something I think that's a fair parallel to make when it comes to just the rising costs for economic activity increasing, leading to more inflation. John, would you agree with that? Do you think there's a similar trend when it came to the oil crises of the 70s?
It's a very different cause, but similar in the sense that today, look, if governments are hell-bent on trying to force this migration away from a carbon-dependent economy, if they're really going to push that hard, someone's going to have to pay. And we know how the world works, right? The middle class will pay, right? The working middle class will pay the bill for that. Why? Because, well, relatively poor people don't have much savings to be confiscated through financial repression or whatever in the first place, and relatively wealthy people are able to structure their tax affairs and whatnot to avoid the punitive taxes that would otherwise require. So, I mean, that's what's going to happen, right? Households will get squeezed by higher energy prices if governments try to force this zero carbon world on them. A world that, don't get me wrong, I mean, there's all kinds of wonderful technologies being developed, but the idea that you can do that sort of migration in a short period of time with largely unproven technologies in many cases that are heavily dependent on subsidies, taxes, right? The idea that you can do that on anything like the time frame they're talking about, first of all, it's simply not possible, in my opinion. And if you try to do it, you're going to so undermine your middle class finances with the squeeze between higher input costs on the one hand and frozen I should say forms of financial repression hitting their savings on the other, that politically that is going to lead to a populist wave that will make Trump look like a storm in a teacup, as it were, to mix metaphors.
Yeah. No. I think that's a fair observation. I'd certainly agree with you on that point, John. We do get a comment here from Jane, who says that China has already backed its currency with gold. They just haven't announced it yet. When they do, and who doesn't believe that will happen when they launch their central bank digital currency? I think it is interesting to see the China dynamic when it comes to its gold holdings, because when we've been talking about the 1970s, this is when America was the largest oil consumer of them all. And that, of course, has changed. China is now the largest oil consumer, and America is now a net oil producer now, though things, of course, in the fracking world have been pretty nasty over the past year. But if we're just talking in broad terms, the field has somewhat changed when China is now the biggest customer for the oil producers, and America now makes so much of its own that while it doesn't use, the fracked oil doesn't just stay in America. It needs to get refined and so on. But just in terms of the amount of oil that is coming out of the fracking wells and the amount that America consumes, they are producing more of this fracked oil than they are consuming it. So this has changed the game a lot. John, when it comes to the amount of gold that China's got and just how the field has changed for America since the 70s, do you think there's something similar going on here?
Look, I mean, first of all, it's very difficult to be certain regarding what China's official gold reserves are. And indeed, it's hard to get a grip on how much gold there is inside China specifically, that is, including the private sector, to the extent, of course, that China does have a private sector.
Right.
However, certainly everyone can agree they have been accumulating gold at an elevated pace for many years. They don't really export gold at all. They mine a lot of it, both in their own territory and through associations with Mongolia, other Central Asian countries, and so on. Given all of that, that is what we've discussed about the state of the world and what we can see in terms of China accumulating gold at an elevated pace, I would be absolutely surprised if there were not very, very high level plans already existing in China for how, under what conditions, etc., they would begin to use gold, to monetize gold in some way, either to back their currency, possibly, or merely as a basis for international trade settlement, such as could happen under Bretton Woods. And I believe that is the idea that no such planning exists in China, I think is absurd. I really think it's just the idea that they wouldn't be thinking about it is of course they're thinking about it, but the questions remain. When, under what conditions, and how they would go about monetizing gold in some way. I think the same discussion that is taking place in Russia, probably has been for some time, and it's interesting to see that Russia's sovereign wealth fund has reduced its holdings of dollar assets to zero.
Yes. John, on that note, when you say it's wild to think that the Chinese Communist Party haven't thought of some way of monetizing gold, and they don't have some plan in their back pocket, maybe it's an emergency plan rather than their primary approach. For me, the Chinese Communist Party is so obsessed with control, right? When it comes to controlling capital inside the country, controlling capital that comes into the country, preventing capital that leaves. As you've already said, with gold holdings, we don't know how much is there, and that's quite deliberate that we don't know. They don't want us to know how much gold is in the country. They want to keep their hand close to the chest. I wonder, do you think the Chinese Communist Party would really be willing to surrender some of its control over its own domestic economy and its international trade balance to what is effectively the international gold market? Because that's something I find hard to bend my head around. When you've seen such desire to take the economy into your hands, in what scenario would you want to let it free again?
Right, right. Well, look, I mean, this is where again you can find some interesting historical parallels here, right? There was a time when Britain was protectionist.
Oh yeah, big time, big time.
And basically Britain had to come to the realization that it had more to benefit from openness and reasonably free trade than it had to lose. And China has been following a very mercantilist, export-led policy for decades, very successfully for the most part. But the point is, at some point, the relative balance of power within the CCP and its sources of economic power domestically is going to begin to shift away from production towards consumption. And the Chinese economy will be under internal pressure to rebalance itself in that way. When that begins to happen, China may begin to see some benefit from finally beginning to open up more vis-a-vis the rest of the world, easing capital controls, allowing for a better balance of exports and imports. If they begin to do that, then it becomes far less painful and indeed, I would say, outright logical to consider monetizing gold in some way, because what's the alternative? That is, if the alternative is to still have a purely unbacked currency vis-a-vis the dollar, the euro, the yen, and all these other purely unbacked currencies, you're going to be stuck in this situation where everyone is going to be tempted to kind of be in this race to the bottom, to inflate and devalue as much as they can vis-a-vis other economies to retain competitiveness. But if you've already established your position as the world's largest, most competitive economy, which China is arguably on course to do, then you don't want to play that game anymore, right? You want to solidify that position. You want to stabilize that position. And the best way to do that is to stabilize the money.
Yeah. I would push back maybe and say, John, Britain as it was when it was mercantilist, what isn't quite the same as China as it is today under the CCP. But I do.
No. I don't look. I don't mean to suggest that the CCP is comparable to the various political parties that were duking it out in Britain during the Industrial Revolution. That's not what I'm saying at all.
Yeah, I understand.
I'm just talking that purely underlying sort of natural forces and dynamics that will influence any regime, be it top-down authoritarian or more bottom-up democratic. The fact is, both types of regimes have they have to respond to those sorts of developments somehow. And don't get me wrong, I far prefer the bottom-up, open, democratic approach. But the idea that an authoritarian regime won't respond to those sorts of forces, I think is wrong. I think they will.
Yeah, because of course they don't operate in a vacuum. They are subject to the economic pressures that are levied on them by the rest of the world, especially when it's a country like China, which trades so much with the rest of the world. If we have got a little bit of time left, I think we'll go through a few other questions or a few other comments. And let's see. If we're just looking at the UK needing stability and real wealth creation for stability by growing, extracting, and making. Yeah, it is interesting to see what a multipolar world would do for manufacturing, John. Do you think a multipolar world where it's not just the US consuming everything else, do you think this would lead to the resurgence of big manufacturing engineering in America?
I think that's one of the silver linings here. don't get me wrong, every country would love to be able to print money to pay for imports, right? Everyone would love to live in the Emerald City of Oz, where no one really works, everyone just enjoys life.
Sounds
Look,
good.
but that's a recipe for long-term economic decline and disaster. And one of the silver linings of a multipolar world in which the dollar does not have this preeminence and this implied tailwind of low real interest rates is that you will get a rebalancing, and it will perhaps help to stem the decline of the middle class in the United States. I would argue that in Great Britain, a similar thing would take place. You would see a recovery in manufacturing, and you would see a sort of a stabilization of this long-term trend decline of the middle class. Now, that said, one has to hope that the overall economic policy picture in the US and the UK would be supportive of that. But other factors equal, if you get real interest rates moving higher, that implies a naturally higher savings rate. That implies that you are less likely to be as export non-competitive and import dependent.
Yep.
And those things, in theory, should all help to restore manufacturing and bolster the middle class. Not immediately, but over a sort of multi-decade period, you would see that trend reverse, in my opinion.
Right. John, there was an email that I received ahead of time. It was quite a lengthy one. I think it's definitely related to this when we're talking about fiat money and we're talking about gold. Petrodollar is obviously very much linked to that, a way of making fiat money that people actually, the market really wants to acquire. And we were, of course, speaking last week in our last episode of Southbank Live about the Nixon gold shock. We've got a question here. Since we now have fiat money, money which is not backed by anything and is only money because we decide it is, why can't we unmake unnecessary money as well as make necessary money? I've just listened to the podcast entitled "Why Don't the Central Banks Buy and Write Off All the Debt?" This appears to be the mechanism by which money can be unmade. So why can't we use it? The answer from John Butler is that we can't trust politicians. They will just use the mechanism to make whatever money they need and whenever they need it. I entirely agree with John Butler. However, why can't we unmake just that money created to ease the pandemic? The unmaking would be limited to pandemic money and no other. Any UK laws passed to support this would insist that it was not only legally possible for UK crises and not a generally available mechanism. A very interesting idea here, John. I would hazard to guess that money that has been created through, for example, the commercial banking system, just through banks making loans, is very, very hard to unmake in that way. What would be your response to this listener?
Well, look, there's a lot of academic debate on this topic nowadays because we are living in this very odd world of zero interest rates. We've been living through policy responses to the COVID shock with loads and loads of stimulus being thrown around in many forms in essentially all countries, and so you're throwing all this money around, and you're paying zero interest on it. What? Gee, how nice! But this leads some people to go one step farther, and this is the modern monetary theory crowd, sort of, right? Which is kind of that, well, maybe there is sort of a free lunch after all. Why do governments pay any interest on their debt, full stop? And that is related to this discussion about whether central banks should just buy up whatever remaining debt there is and just monetize it. Well, okay, I mean, on paper that sounds great, but the problem is that in my opinion misallocates resources, and that doesn't mean that when you have a national emergency there isn't a public interest in the government taking action in what might admittedly be some top down way, which everyone is expected to pay for. And maybe they're expected to pay for it through inflation. Maybe they're expected to pay for it through a poll tax. Who knows what it might be. Look, that's a political decision, right? When you're faced with a shock, which might be a natural disaster, who knows what it might be. When you're faced with a shock, that's a very public decision. How are we going to pay for this? And maybe you do just write off some portion of the debt in order to do so. But the idea that somehow that is a free lunch is absolutely wrong. It's not. Somebody has to pay, and it's really just a political decision who's going to pay and how they're going to pay.
Yeah, it does seem somewhat inevitable that we're going to get that we're going to see these kind of questions get put forward without, of course, the caveat that somebody has to pay for it, right? That it's, it's all right. It's the public money, it's the government's money, and we'll create and maybe destroy some of it, however we like, but it's all in the public interest. When you start looking into the modern monetary theory ideas, there are it's very interesting, the debate around it, where you have some really established economists being unable to agree really on what money actually is when they're asking really fundamental questions about money, which you'd think was sort of the basic input for understanding economics. There's huge disagreement here, even amongst the.
I had this discussion with our colleague Nick Hubble recently, and this is the problem, right? Is that people can't even agree what money is anymore because
No,
money has changed so much
no,
through
no.
the decades. We've lost our sense of what money really is, and there are three traditional definitions of money that everyone cites all the time, but there's actually a fourth that we have forgotten, that the mainstream has forgotten, and they don't even mention it anymore. And the three definitions that are common within the mainstream are, that money is a store of value, a unit of account, and a medium of exchange. But the fourth one is that money also represents the final extinguishing and settlement of debt. So when you have a debt-backed monetary system, that definition gets thrown out the window.
Right.
And people start confusing money and debt as being one and the same thing. They are not the same thing. But we live in a world now where the economic mainstream has completely forgotten that, hence why they get themselves tied up in knots trying to have an intelligent discussion about what money really is.
Yeah, of course, if debt is money, well, then really indebted nations must be really, really, really wealthy.
Exactly. Exactly. They're not the same thing.
Yeah, quite. It is interesting that I've not actually heard that before from you, John, about that. The fourth definition of money. I think we do well to remember that these days, especially as well, debt is seeming to be completely fine. No one cares about governments being indebted anymore, and maybe they've simply just gotten confused that debt and money are just the
But
same thing.
this is what J.P. Morgan was saying. People quote J.P. Morgan all the time, right? Gold is money. Everything else is credit. This is exactly what he's saying. The two are not the same.
Quite. Now, John, this has been a great discussion on the petrodollar. We are getting on for time, but it's now 4 minutes to 11 in the morning on a fine Friday. And it's 20th of August. We've done quite a few episodes of this so far, getting into a nice rhythm of it. But I think we shall cut it off there. For all those watching, thank you so much for tuning in. It's been a great little discussion that we've had here. If you do like it, feel free to subscribe and tune in next week, because we are doing these every week. But that is all we'll do for now. Hope everyone listening is going to have a good weekend. There will be a recording of this, of course, if you do want to look over it again. And we'll be back next week. John, thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure, Boaz.
Thank you all. We'll see you next time.